We'll get started. I'll start off with a bit of an introduction. Just a reminder, as people starting to come in, if you can, please turn your videos and your microphones off. That would be great. It just helps with how people see the presentation and avoids any echo and those kind of things. So my name's Amon Martin. I've been at TCDC for about 5 years, and I've been working on this project for almost 3. Got a background in flood protection, so this is the type of thing suited to, I guess, my qualifications and experience. So that's a good thing. But this project's not just about me. There's a whole team sits behind this project. There's a couple of people I'll introduce. One of them is John. She's leading the project from the consultant side. Hi there, Sian.
Kia ora.
And we also have Alejandro from Waikato Regional Council and Rick Leafting.
Kia ora, everyone.
Kia ora.
So I'll share my presentation now and start talking through some of the slides. Hopefully this works well. Haven't had too many problems with technology, but there's always a first. So tonight is all about Tairua, but it's about Tairua and the area that's most at risk to flooding inundation. So that's the town centre and the area around Pepe Reserve. So that's the focus of discussions tonight. We can look at other things, so there's a bit of scope to answer questions and look at other areas, and anything that comes up we can try and answer. But there's two purposes really. One is to ensure there's an awareness of the project with the people that might be most affected. So that's why a lot of people may have, or hopefully have got, letters out to them to advise them of this event this evening. And then also we want feedback. We want to know what you think about what we're proposing to do in response to the hazards and the challenges that this area faces. So I'm going to start with an overview of the Shoreline Management Plan project. That's a pretty big project, and just to set the scene and give some context to what we're talking about. Then we're going to talk about Tairua's specifically and the hazards and the details there, and just going to finish off with how to provide feedback. So throughout, there'll be opportunities for questions. So what we're going to do for questions and feedback, if you put it into the chat, Sian's going to help by every now and again we'll stop and we'll look over to the questions and she'll read them out, and either myself, maybe Rick Leafting or Alejandro or Sian will answer those questions. And so that's we found a reasonable way of getting specific feedback tailored to what you're most interested in.
Amon, sorry to interrupt you, but I think you need to reshare your screen.
Good. I think I jinxed myself when I said I hadn't had problems with technology. Here we go.
That's it. Perfect.
So why a shoreline management plan? You don't have to look too far around the district to see actual hazard occurrences, either erosion or flooding. It seems to be somewhere in the district gets hit at least every year. You've got Moana Tairua down the bottom and Thames. On the east coast, you've got quite a lot of erosion issues, but also flooding as well. So the project is to help us become more resilient, or help us find solutions to these coastal challenges. So that's coastal flooding and coastal erosion mostly. We have considered other things, but they've been the focus of the project. How have we done this? There's guidance from the Ministry for the Environment on how to do this. So this is just a one page from that guidance. I think it's probably several hundred pages in terms of the document. But you've got to start by understanding what's happening in terms of the hazards. So doing hazard assessments, understanding what areas are impacted. An important step is what the community wants, what they value, what their objectives would be, and also understanding how the things community might value, things like access or reserves or just buildings or their homes, how those are at risk. And then you move around to number 5, or what we can do about it. Look at all the various pathways and all the various options, and then start to think about the different options over time, which really is about the pathways. So you may have one option for a while and then move to another one. So that's the idea behind pathways. So going back a couple of years or year and a half, this is some consultation events we had back then, and some of the key words came out in terms of access is important, the beaches are important, and the environment is important. Also worth needing to mention is who in terms of the project. So a key part of the project involves coastal panels. Because this project is so big, 400 kilometres, we've broken the area up into 4. And so we've got a southeast panel, which is representing this area. So a lot of the technical information goes to the panel. Supporting the panel is a technical group, and that involves or includes Waikato Regional Council, Waka Kotahi, TCDC staff, our consultants, and others who contribute as well. So we sit alongside those panels, digesting the information, understanding it, looking at what the community values, and trying to make good recommendations. Above that, there's a governance committee, and that includes 4 councillors, and there's 4 iwi reps on that governance committee. So from council, there's Terry Walker, I think, is from your area, Sandra Gowdy, Robin Sinclair, and Tony Fox. So those are the 4 TCD councillors. So the hazard assessment. So understanding where the water is going to go in a big event is important. I've kind of touched on it a bit, but it's not just where the water goes, but what sits behind or under the water that's important. So how vulnerable are certain areas? If it's a golf course, perhaps in Tairua, that might be a lot more resilient to flooding than the houses or the state highway. So looking at the hazards and what's under the hazards gives us an idea of the risk. Couple of points that you may not have, well, I'll kind of repeat. The project's a 3-year project. We're hoping to complete in the next 3 or 4 months. The project includes 400 kilometres of coastline. We've broken up the areas into coastal panels into 4, and we've worked through the risks, and we're at the point now where we're looking at pathways and solutions. And so we're here today focusing on Tairua and the kind of town area to get feedback from residents. Are there any questions on the shoreline management plan in general, or any questions at this stage?
Amon, there are no questions in the chat at the moment. So just for the people online, if you're not familiar with the chat function on Teams, it's at the top of your screen on the just right of centre, there's a little sort of speech bubble and the word chat under it. If you click on that, then a panel comes up down the right and it says type a new message. So any questions, any comments, type them in there, and then we'll answer them. Now, we're going to have other breaks. So if you think of something in a minute or so, just put it in and we'll come back to those questions.
Thank you, Sian. I'll keep going. So Tairua details, 3 things we're going to focus on here is the hazard assessment, so what the hazard assessment is showing for this area. We've looked at protection. in a general sense from what's feasible, and we'll talk about that as well. And then we'll come, which I think is the key part of what we want to tell you and get feedback on, is to the pathways. So we're at a point where we've got recommended pathways, but they're not final. They're not final recommendations. So we want more feedback on whether you think those are correct or need to change, whether the timing looks okay. So that's what we're going to focus on just now. So in terms of Tairua, this is the area we're looking at or thinking about most closely right now. We have, or hopefully they've landed in the letterboxes over the last few days, sent letters to the people within the area shown as flooded here. And that's to try and encourage them to be either aware of what we're doing and contribute. So a couple of things on the hazard assessment. The hazard assessment relates to flooding or inundation. And first question I kind of posed to myself is, what is an AEP, a 1% AEP? So that's a flood event that has 1% chance of happening in any year. So it's quite an extreme event, normally quite large because it's quite a rare event. And in theory, it wouldn't happen statistically it would happen about every 100 years. In reality, that it sometimes happens more often, so it's not a guarantee that you have to wait another 100 years to have such an event. So what you can see here is the 1% flood events. On the legend, you also see SLR. What does that mean? That means sea level rise. So for the blue area is 0 sea level rise. And so if we had a 1 in 100 year event today, or a 1% AEP, we would expect flooding to occur in the blue areas. That doesn't mean that the houses are necessarily flooded. It means that the ground levels, or there is water on the ground. At that first increment, it might be less damaging to houses because it's quite low, or could be quite low. But then as you get sea level rise, 0.2, for example, the flooding extends further inland. And so areas within the town start to become flooded. And not just does the flooding extend further, the flooding of the blue area would also get deeper. So there's different sea level rise scenarios, and they go all the way through probably about 100 years out to a 1.4 metre sea level rise scenario. So the next slide is just about that sea level rise. There's quite a bit of uncertainty around how fast sea level rise is going to happen, or how slow, hopefully. So we recognise that there is a range, and over time, I mentioned 100 years, it could be up to 1.4. That is the recommended sea level rise predictions to use by the MFE. So the Ministry for Environment, in terms of that guidance that I mentioned earlier. At the moment, that seems like the right thing to use in terms of recent predictions. This graph's a year or two old. It isn't the most recent. The most recent stuff came out only a month ago, and that didn't alleviate any concerns. Things were looking slightly worse based on the most recent reports. So being conservative and taking that kind of red line, or that 8.5, looks like the right thing to do at this stage. But we also recognise that it may change over time. Hopefully, we can do things as a planet to reduce the impacts in the sea level rise. But at this stage, that's what we're planning for. So before I touch on the next one, has anyone got any questions around the hazard assessment, flooding events, or sea level rise even.
So Amon, there's one question here, and more typing from really the first part of the presentation, and a good point, a useful point's been made, and that the person commenting says the first we heard about this issue was your letter received very recently. Yeah, so do you want me to carry on, Amon? I was going to say.
No, that's a good bit of feedback. We've probably had 5 lots of consultation events. Do we have one? We've had one at the golf course at Tairua. We've had Pawanui, not too far away. I think we've had a couple more specifically in Tairua as well. And we've had events that cover Tairua over the 3 years. And that is not surprising. I mean, I personally don't look out to go along to council events in the evenings. I've often got other things I need to do and concern myself with. And so the letter drop, knowing that it is reaching you for the first time is quite key, because we might have to just do more letter drops if people aren't picking up the radio advertising and the Facebook and the other things. Letter drops might have to be more of a more part of how we're reaching out to people.
And then thanks, Amon. There's a follow-up question saying there's been no mail out of this issue to us in our area. And I think the person in question's talking about the area of where the Graham's Creek flood maintenance scheme covers. So they talk about paying the $43 a year for the flood maintenance in Graham's Creek.
Yep, no, that's good to raise that. So we didn't mail out to the Graham's Creek residents. It's very much the area shown here on the map, and the reason is what we're considering is flood protection or new protection from coastal inundation for this area. So the houses at the front could be significantly affected either by not having protection and being flooded, or by having protection right outside their houses. So the focus of tonight was going to be on these areas and the pathway, but we are open to looking beyond here and then thinking about Graham's Creek to some extent. And so luckily we do have our WRC friends along here with us to talk about that if needed. Anything? Yes, Sian, sorry.
Yep. So there's if you go back to that picture you just had, Amon, which shows the hazard in Tairua, there's a question here: what is the flood depth in the blue area at 0 meters sea level rise?
It would depend on what house and what location. So if you could, hopefully you can see my pointer at the very edge of that line where it goes up. The depth would be virtually 0, so it'd be virtually no depth. And then as you move down in terms of lower ground level, the water level would stay the same, and the depth would be dependent on that ground level. So different all the way across the blue areas, depending on the ground level, but in terms of depth, different depths, but the actual water level would be quite consistent. So if you knew what the water level of the road was up here, you could kind of get a feel for what your house might be exposed to. If you knew your house was, I don't know, 0.5 metre below the road, or 200 mil below the road, then you get a feel for how deep the water would be. We probably there is more information on more detailed information on the flood extents, and I'll point to that at the end. But yeah, that's a good point that people are interested in the actual depth as well, which we might think about how we communicate that better.
So there's just two more questions. One is just or comments reiterating the point about letter drops. And there's a suggestion here that TCDC has our email addresses, and that's a better way of involving ratepayers than, for example, Facebook. So I think that's good information for how we contact people in the future. And then there's another comment about Graham's Creek, which is that Graham's Creek also comes in the back of Cowrie, Norfolk and Chestnut, where the pond has just been cleaned out. I think
So that's the northern area up here. Yeah, and there's an interesting aspect to the next slide, which starts to bring in Graham's Creek as well. So I'll talk to the protection aspects, and as you can see on the right hand side is potentially the full extent of what may be needed for flood protection, and there is definitely an overlap with existing flood protection and what's happening in Graham's Creek. So we have looked at protection, however, we haven't done options assessments or detailed design. We've really done a conceptual thinking about what it would look like, and we've made some quite consistent assumptions, some ones being that a flood protection scheme that protects for a 100-year event for 2120, so a 100-year event in 100 years' time. In addition, we've also had the assumptions about wave run-up. Not sure how much wave run-up specifically affects in this area, but there's wave run-up and storm surge and waves that we don't want to overtop the flood protection. So you could apply a slightly different approach and not include all of those things, and sometimes you would have freeboard rather than including those things to give yourself a bit of a buffer for those kind of uncertainty with those things. So it's a very conservative approach, and it isn't a detailed design, and that's the extent that is going. And so when you see that extent, you might say, oh, actually, do we really need to protect the golf course in 100 years' time to a 100-year level? Is it okay that the golf course floods every 10 years or every 5 years? So there hasn't been that assessment of different levels for different locations, or exactly how it might tie into Graham's Creek either. But at a high level, we have looked at it and assessed it. And so the height in terms of that conservative approach is 4.8 in terms of the level, and that's about on average 2 meters high. So it could be a 2 meter high embankment mostly, so a stop bank type scenario, or it could be a 2 meter high wall. And that's not something that's needed today, and it's only something that you would think about putting in place if you did get all that sea level rise up to 1.4 and you wanted that very comprehensive defence in terms of a 100-year level of protection. The costs of this have been assessed in the order of 87 million, so it's expensive. I think the relative costs around the district are pretty good because we have made or included the same assumptions. So when we've looked at Thames and Whirianga and Te Puru and Tairua, other places on the Thames coast, we've used all the same assumptions. I should remember better, but it's about 280, 260 or 80 for Thames and 320-ish in Whirianga. So Tairua is significant, but it's less than other places, some of those other bigger places. So another chance for questions.
And there's another comment here about, I think, how we contact people, and it's to do with the 50% of the properties are holiday homes, so people don't live in Tairua permanently. So again, I think that's the email type approach is a better one for them. And then there's a question here, are you talking a wall along Sea Edge Manaia Road? And if so, what are you intending to build it from? And is this another ratepayer cost? So there's 3 questions there. Along the sea edge of Manaia Road.
So firstly on the contact, we have landowner addresses. So if the addresses are, so if it's a batch and the address given for contact is a place in Auckland, that means that the letter does go to the address that people have put with council. So hopefully that reaches some of the people that are non-resident owners. In terms of a sea wall at Manaia, probably go up here. We have shown here that it's a low scour embankment just about everywhere. So even with that 100-year event, we are not necessarily needing. There's probably a very small exception, maybe here where there's a stream. We're not necessarily needing walls. That could become a challenge if there's not enough room. And so kind of moving onto the pathway, and you can see an existing, well, you either know about having seen it on the ground, or you can just pick it up in this photo or in this map, that there is a low level bund that runs along the extent of Pepe Reserve. I think it's Pepe Reserve all the way along there. And so that does offer some protection, but it doesn't look like it's complete or high enough to fully keep out a 100-year event. And so we've taken that protection option, we've kind of parked it, we've recognised that that is something for the very, very long term. And then we've looked at it with the coastal panels, and we've said, well, we don't necessarily need protection to that level. And so this is what the pathway is starting to show. And so just pause a sec to get my thinking around how to explain this pathway best. So I mean, you start at the left-hand side, and what's shown is for a period of time, we should improve the existing and formal defences. So the bund that is there, and that could be sufficient right through to 0.2 metres of sea level rise. At 0.2 metres of sea level rise, we would start to see a 5% or a 1 in 20-year event over top the bund. So relatively low cost up to that 0.2. And then we would look at a new coastal protection to built in phases. So you wouldn't jump to a big seawall, and you wouldn't build what we've costed and looked at in terms of the feasibility study. You would look at building something in increments, and we've suggested 0.4 would be an appropriate increment. In some ways, quite good if we don't have to worry about walls or don't have to use walls, because often a stop bank can be built at a lower level and just topped up. So you can add fill on top of a stop bank. If it's a wall, you really have to have the foundations designed for the height of the wall at the start, but the stop bank offers a bit more flexibility. And so the thing that's being, and we think that's feasible for the long term. And so the project spans out to 100 years, and potentially we could, or we're saying we think we could protect for that long term. Possibly not the protection that is in our feasibility study. It could be a lower level, may not be all the way around the golf course. We've need to tie into the Graham's Creek stuff effectively. And then in terms of timeframes, we aren't really specific about timeframes, but if you were to look at the graphs which have uncertainty, the 0.2 meters of sea level rise would, you can see down here, be in 24 years, and the 0.4 would be in 43 years. So effectively, you're doing what we're suggesting the plan is to improve the informal defences so that the low level bund and make sure it's a consistent height and provides a consistent level of protection, and that would be enough for at least the 24 years. We don't want to get to a point where we've got overtopping at this line. We would want to have implemented something a bit more significant before we got to that flooding at 0.4. And then the only thing that makes it a little bit confusing is right in the middle, we have another pathway. And at the moment, this pathway doesn't really require any attention. This pathway specifically relates to the state highway. So there could be flooding in an extreme event now, but if the road's closed once every 100 years or once every few years, that's probably acceptable. That happens around the Coromandel quite often. But once we got to 0.2, we would want to, or we would be advocating or hoping that we could either raise the road or use the protection to the protection that also protects the community to ensure the road doesn't get flooded too often. Hopefully that gives some context in terms of what the pathway sets. Well, we've done the options assessment or the feasibility study. It shouldn't be seen as what we're going to build. It's a piece of work that gives an idea of what's possible in the very long term and what it might look like. But it's, in this case, definitely not something we're advocating building in the next probably 40 years. Any questions? And then I'll probably ask some more pointed questions so I can get feedback from you. But any questions just to explain that or add more information on that?
Yeah, there's a couple, Eamon. So just as a comment, first of all, there was a question about how do we get a copy of this presentation? And in the chat, we've responded that it will be made available on the TCDC website on the SMP page, which you're going to show in a bit. But Jamie's also put the link in the chat to that page. So that's helpful in terms of being able to find it. In terms of a question, there's a question about the cost. Is this another ratepayer cost?
So we haven't costed what the interim approaches would be. So we would hope that low level informal improving the defences would be a relatively low cost, and alongside of not knowing the smaller cost is we haven't worked out a targeted rate or a way to rate for that cost. It would almost certainly fall back to, at least in some extent, ratepayers, and probably more heavily on the people who benefit from the protection. So if the people shown in blue, or the houses, the property shown in blue here, would probably receive the most benefit and would probably pay more for the protection. And those are the properties we've tried to encourage to come along for feedback. And this is kind of one of my questions back to you, if you prefer not to have protection as a landowner in one of those blue areas and accept a level of risk, periodic flooding, maybe your floor level is actually a bit higher and you don't mind every 100 years or every 20 years water coming up through your gardens, knowing that you prefer not to have protection is something we'd want to hear, because that can influence our decision. And it may not be as kind of hard and fast as not wanting protection, but it may be a case of being willing to accept more risk. So we don't actually do anything here. We're suggesting we need to have something in place before sea level rise gets to 0.4, maybe 0.6 is acceptable, and we can actually wait quite a bit longer before we start needing to do things. So that's some of the types of feedback we would like. Another piece of feedback after it as well, in the long term, the bund would actually end up being quite big. If you kept a bund and didn't go for a wall, I'd suggest a bund would be the better option. But as we did detailed design, a wall might come out as being favourable for some reasons. One option, because there's quite a wide, big bund in the long term, is actually to use, think of the right word, but you may not be able to push the bund out into the coastal zone. So the bund or the stop bank may have to start encroaching into the properties. And so if there's property owners who feel strongly about the bund encroaching landward versus encroaching seaward, we would also like to hear that. And as kind of an extreme scenario to allow more open space, it has been suggested, by no means a recommendation, but actually the houses in the highest risk flood area are relocated, and then that provides more open space to the community. If there's feedback on that, also like to hear that, and we'll take that feedback back to the coastal panel. That's not something that's in there now, but it's something that has been talked about by people in the past.
So Eamon, I think you've covered this, but you might want to just summarise it. It's please clarify what you're recommending in the next 5 years and what people will have to pay for. And then also the use of the term pathways not understood as being a proposal or recommended option. So it's what are we suggesting for the next few years?
So for Tairua, we're not necessarily going to do much in the next one or 2 or 3 years, but probably when you're thinking about 5 years, that's when improving the existing defences would come into play. So you can see the bund that's already there, because it's got different colours, that actually highlights that the bund is at different levels. So the bund should be, if it was going to provide a consistent protection, it would be at a consistent level. So you might expect the highest point or the highest level of the bund to be carried through, and if there are low points, maybe at the playground or at the upper end, making sure the bund connects into high ground so it can't be outflanked. So that's in the short and medium term, kind of 5 to 20 years, what we'd be suggesting is the approach. Alongside that, there's a need to think about pumping, so whether or not the water can get out. I know there is some floodgates in the area, and those are usually effective for drainage, but there may be a need for a pump at some location because you could be cutting off the water from getting out. So in the short term, that's what the pathway is suggesting we look at. We haven't done the detailed design for that short-term option, but we would, once the plan's adopted, would prioritise things across the district and would look to have a detailed design and costing for the short-term option, and that wouldn't be necessarily in the next 1 or 2 years. It could be three or 4, and then would see how that option would be paid for, probably sitting with the people that would benefit the most.
So there's a couple of comments here, Eamon, of support for that, what you've just been talking about. That's shorter term strategy. So happy to go with the upgrade of the existing bund. It protects everyone, particularly in the blue area. And then another, there's been nothing done to maintain or increase the height of the existing bund in the 35 years I've been coming to Tairua. Surely this could start now and be done over a long period of time.
That's really good feedback. That's the type of thing we want to hear. And I think part of it is there hasn't been a formal level of service established for that bund. So it's not actually recognised anywhere that this is providing flood protection. So that's part of that short-term improvement is saying we will ensure this provides a level of service to these houses. May not be 100-year protection, or maybe, but at least knowing what you're getting from that bund is important.
This next comment relates to that, Eamon. It's people are still being allowed to build new and no doubt expensive homes along the Manaia Road bund. We built our new batch at 1 metre above existing ground level. Is this enough, or should it be higher if you're considering relocations?
In terms of is it enough, you could consider the sea level rise projections, and you might be able to say that if your garden's getting flooded now, in probably 2100, 75 odd years from now, your house would be at risk of being flooded if sea level rise happens as anticipated. So you've future-proofed your house for 75 years might be one way of looking at, and whether that's enough is, I guess, up to the individuals to think about. I don't imagine any of us will be here in 75 years, but you may be thinking longer term than that, the next generation type thing. So was there a second part to that question, or was that?
So that's it, Eamon. So those are all the questions at the moment.
Okay, so the next, that's asking about questions and feedback. We've done that already. The next thing just to highlight is how to provide feedback. So we've got a little bit on the chat already. So keep going if you're able to, or you have things you want to put down. Also email our coast. That's the email address there, ourcoast@bcbc.gov.nz, and you would have got the website in the chat, but I will try and open that up just to kind of talk you through what's on there. So the address is our standard website, just with the SMP at the end, or the /SMP. There's information about the different coastal panels. So even though it might be for some people, Tairua is the only place to be and the only place to worry about, we've actually looked at 140 different areas in a similar way. And so the Thames Coast information can be downloaded here, Coromandel, Mercury Bay, and then you get to your area here. So the southeast, you might want to look across the Whangamata or across the Pawanui and see what's happening there. Not a focus for this meeting, but could be of interest. Meeting times for other meetings coming up, and then just working our way down. If you want to get a feel for the consultation that's happened, there's a 2 or 3 minute video that gives you a bit of a snapshot there. And probably the one I did want to point out, and there it is. So people did ask about how deep flooding might be in certain events. So there's a lot more information about flood events in here. So if you click that here button, you can download what a 5% or 20-year event would look like, and also king tides. So the one thing we looked at for the coastal panels is if there's a metre of sea level rise and we start getting king tides affecting roads or houses, that sometimes is a threshold that we're saying, no, that's not bearable. We don't want to be flooded every king tide. And all that background information that has gone into support what we think are thresholds for the community is sitting here. And then the final thing is just that other way to provide feedback. And so after you see the other meetings, you've got this area here, the feedback tool. And Sian, are you still good to talk us through that one? Hopefully people are still hearing and seeing me. It looks like my screen's frozen a little bit.
Sorry, Amon, that was my fault. I was showing my screen, but not had my mute button on. So all I was saying is that I was repeating what you had said about the link, the feedback link on the web page. That takes you to another window, which is that feedback tool in itself. There's a home page, and that home page just provides you with some background information on the project, how we've divided the coast up, and it gives you some sort of prompting questions about what you might like to think about, and tells you how to use this tool and how to add comments. So if you then click onto the map, which is the interesting bit, it just repeats that information about how to add a comment, and it takes you to the whole of the Coromandel. From that, you can then select the particular stretch of coast you're interested in by literally just by clicking on that stretch of coast. So I've done that already here for the Tairua and Tairua estuary and Pawanui. You can see I've zoomed in, and there's a comment here that's been made in the past: identify where coastal wetlands can retreat to and protect low-lying land from drainage and infilling. There's a comment here. So what I've done now is I've clicked on the Graham's Creek, because we were talking about that earlier area, and you can see on the left-hand side it brings up the post, so the information about that location. Then if you click again on that link to the poster, you get that information in more detail, so you can look at it close up. It's not interactive like some of the mapping that Amon was showing you, but it shows you the forecast for that area against a 100-year event, and it also shows you the pathway that you're thinking about adopting. In this case, it's about maintaining and improving those WRC defences. The way you then leave a comment is there's a little button here, add comment. And as I said, the instructions tell you how to do this. It tells you you add a new feature, gives you this little arrow, and you can put that arrow wherever you want, click on that part of the coast, and then it will tell you to type your comment. You type your comment and you send that information in, and it's maintained on that map. So that, in a nutshell, is how this works. And when yeah.
I had a turn of leaving the mute on. Thank you very much, Sian. We do have WRC people with us. Was there any comments or things they wanted to add?
Hi, Amon. Yeah, Rick Leafney here, and kia koutou, everyone out there. So no, I think you've explained things very well. I think from just a general comment, is just ensuring people that this is almost the start of this adaptation project. We'll get in terms of we've collated all the information that we could so far through the community panels and the information that we've had already from the community. We've put things together as a first cut, a first go at it, and now it's really up to the community as well to understand what those options are and to provide the feedback. This is for the community. We want to hear that feedback. but there is still a long way to go in this process before you know, some of those bigger ticket items down the track need to be decided. But you know, there are some things that we can see here that along this stretch here in Tairua that can be started relatively quickly, you know, in terms of those upgrading the defences, and there's probably some of those other projects that I saw there in the comments around clearing pipes and things like that in terms of your general maintenance. But again, this is for the community. This is a community-led process, so it's important that the community puts their 2 cents in. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. And I'll probably just finish up by saying this isn't the last presentation we'll be doing. We hope to come back in person at a guess. I'd say we'll be at the golf club again, probably in six or 8 weeks-ish, and hopefully we're able to meet in person and things are a bit less restricted. So look forward to seeing you, some of you in person then. Otherwise, have a good evening. Appreciate you taking up some time to hear what we've had to say. Thanks very much.